Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about NestJS authentication. Specifically, we're going to discuss how do you get a user logged in, how do you protect your APIs with things like JWT, or perhaps you want to use sessions. All of the different strategies involved with any of that we're going to discuss in this video, so make sure to stick around. And as always, if you find this video helpful at all, I would appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe if you want to see more. With that said, let's get started. So as you can see in my desktop here, I created a new NestJS project using the CLI. If you're completely new to NestJS, I do have a crash course in my channel. Make sure to check that out, and that'll walk you through exactly how to set up a application from scratch. So I won't cover that here. So we're just starting with a very basic skeleton app here. So just as a quick intro in general, how authentication works in NestJS is really via PassportJS. So those of you that are coming from the Express world, Passport has been around forever. I'm sure you've heard of it. If not, I recommend looking into it a little bit before you continue into this video. But the gist of it is that Passport kind of provides think of it as like a single interface to doing authentications, but it offers you the ability to use different strategies. So for example, if we go into search strategies here, you'll see some of the popular ones, right? So like there's one for maybe Facebook logins, Google logins, maybe your basic local username and password, which we'll do in this tutorial. Maybe you're doing auth0, JWT. The basic idea is that Passport kind of gives you this layer, and then you can kind of just switch your authentication strategy to whatever you want, which is really nice. And the nice thing with NestJS is they basically just created like a light wrapper on top of Passport, so that they're not really reinventing the wheel here. They're just kind of augmenting it to fit the Nest landscape. So basically, if you've used Passport before, a lot of that knowledge will transfer over into NestJS. All right, so back in the code, generally what you need to do to get started, assuming you already have your NestJS application, is you're going to install NestJS/Passport, Passport itself, and then the strategy that you're going to use. In this tutorial, we're going to try Passport Local. Passport Local is sort of just this very basic authentication strategy where we want to allow the user to provide a username and password in their request, and that's how they log in, right? And then the implementation of what happens after that is dependent on how we're going to implement it. You also often have to install the types for your strategy. So usually you should be able to find that on types and then the name of your strategy. This is assuming that the strategy was originally written perhaps in JavaScript, and then the community provided types for it. All right, so with that installation out of the way, let's first kind of manipulate our initial controller to provide some basic routes so that we kind of have a direction of where we're heading towards. Let's imagine that we are implementing a login route. So what we have here effectively is we're providing a route for logging in, and once that user is logged in, we're going to allow them to proceed making other calls like this /protected one. And the behavior we want here is if they're not yet logged in, we want to make sure this route is protected so that when they call that and they haven't been logged in, we're going to present some kind of HTTP error. All right, the first thing we're going to do actually is initialize a couple of things so that we can sort of simulate a environment where perhaps we have a database of users. We're not going to set up databases in this tutorial. It's a little bit out of scope, but we're going to try and create a mock of that. So I'm just going to do in the terminal nestg module users to generate a new users module, and then I'm also going to do nestg service users to create a users service. So you should see that you have a new users folder here with a users module, and it has the users provider added in there. So what we're going to do here is let's create a basic type of a user, just so we have a sort of a definition of what's the shape of this user. Let's say that this user has an ID, which is just a number. Usually entities in a database will have some kind of unique ID. And then let's give him a name, just a string. And then since we're trying to do local authentication, we're going to do username, which is also string, and password. All right, so imagine that those are the fields that we would be saving in the database. Now within the user service itself, I'm just going to create an array of mock users in here. As you can see, it has these fields that we have: ID, name, username, password. I should call out immediately that obviously this is a tutorial, right? So you should not be storing passwords in plain text like this. I'm just doing it this way because I'm trying to teach. But in a real environment, you should make sure that you're not doing that. You know, perhaps you want to use a package like this, bcrypt, to hash your passwords. You know, do what you have to do to actually do the real security bits of it. All I'm doing here is kind of teaching you the fundamentals of how to get all these things kind of wired up together, but you still have a little bit to learn on your own, you know, to make sure that you're doing things in the most secure way possible. All right, with that out of the way, I'm just going to add a basic find one method here, which allows us to find a user by their username. This should return a user or undefined if not found. So since we just have a pretty basic simple in-memory array here, we're just gonna do this.users.find, and for each user we're just gonna check if the username matches the given username. All right, so pretty basic. Got a user service, we got some mock users, and we just have a method for finding a user by username. Now going back into the users module, kind of giving you a quick hint here is we're going to be using the user service in another module, so we need to provide the user service as an export. If you didn't know, that's kind of how you allow a service from one module to be used in another module. All right, from here we can actually start doing some of the auth stuff. So we're going to create a new module specifically for auth. And similarly, I'm going to create a service for auth as well. All right, now I'm in the auth module. Like we said, we're going to be utilizing that user service that we just created. So we have to make sure to add the users module in here. Now let's take a look at our auth service. All right, so knowing that we're going to be using the user service here, let's start with a constructor that allows us to inject that. So I'm just going to do private user service of type users service. Now what we need to add here is a method for validating a user. And this is something that we're going to utilize later down the chain when we actually start using Passport. We're going to use this method to do the actual validation that, hey, this is an existing user in our database. So we're also going to need to pass in the username here and their password. So imagine that we did call this method, we passed in a username and a password, and we'll get there in a little bit here, but just bear with me here. Imagine that we are calling this and we're passing in a username and password. Where we go from here is we need to try and find that user using our user service, which we just provided a method for that recently, right? So we're gonna do await this.user service that find one, and remember that that takes in a username. So we're just gonna pass in this given username. Now to kind of add some really basic validation, right? We're just gonna check if the given password that's passed into this method matches the one that's in our quote unquote database, which if this actually found an existing user with that same username, this user object is going to have that password, and we just got to make sure that those matches with the one that's given. So if we found a user and user that password matches the passed in password from the argument. Now what we want to do from here is actually return the user itself, assuming that their passwords match. So we're kind of saying, yep, this user exists in our database, let's return that person. However, remember that our user record has also the password and the username in it. So we kind of want to pull that out. So we can do that with some simple destructuring. Let's pull out password and username, and then we'll just do a spread here to get the rest of the user. I'm gonna do that from the user object itself, and then we'll just return the rest here, right? So if we look into, remember we created a basic type here. If we pulled out the username and password, what we have left is just ID and name. So that's what the shape of this rest is going to be. It's just an ID and a name. Now, if we didn't find the user or the password didn't exist, we're simply just going to return null. All right, from here, we're going to add a new file called local.strategy.ts. Now, what this file is going to be is it's going to represent basically the strategy from Passport, which we install, which is the local one. So this extends Passport strategy, and within this we need to pass in the actual strategy that we're trying to use, right? So in our example, we're using the strategy from Passport local. So we're going to take that strategy, we're going to pass it in here. And this is actually going to be, from Nest's perspective, it's going to be a provider. So we're going to make this an injectable. Now this is actually where we're going to be using the AuthService. So we want to, again, create a constructor, and we're going to do the injection in here. So we're going to add AuthService of type AuthService, the one we just created. Now within here, notice that there's red squigglies here because it's looking for you to call super here. Don't forget to do that. This is also the place where if your strategy requires other configuration, this is where you pass in that configuration. So before we continue, let me show you guys some examples. So Passport local itself doesn't really require much more configuration than just that, than what we have. But if you look at other strategies, so for example, let's take a look at the Passport Facebook here. You'll notice that this strategy requires that you pass in client ID and client secret, right? So if you were using this strategy instead of Passport local, maybe you're trying to implement Facebook logins or Google logins, that's where you will pass that object in here with the client ID, client secret, etc. So again, I can't show that to you because local strategy doesn't really require much, if any, configuration. But know that if you're going to be using a different authentication strategy, perhaps you're using a third-party identity provider, this is where you're going to configure it initially. All right, next, what pretty much every single one of these Passport strategy classes require is a validate method. And in the case of local strategy, Passport local, this is going to have username, which is a string, and password, which is a string. And you're probably starting to see where we're heading with this is we're going to look up the user by first using our AuthService, which I actually misspelled. This should be AuthService up here. We're going to validate our user by passing in username and password, right? And remember, it kind of just goes through that whole thing. If the user doesn't have the right password or that user doesn't exist in our database, you're not going to have a user. So if there's no user, we're going to throw a new unauthorized exception. And you might have seen from my previous Nest crash course video, a lot of this, exception handling is done by Nest automatically. You kind of just need to throw specific exception classes and it'll do the job of figuring out what status code goes along with that. And we're going to see this in action in a little bit here. Now, what's missing here is we need to return the user itself. And I also misspelled async here. I'm sorry. And from here, you might be wondering, why are we making so many different services, right? We have the auth service, we have the user service, and then we have this validate function. Why is there so many different services? Well, the idea is separation concerns, right? So the auth service is just in charge of authentication stuff, validating and stuff like that. The user service is specifically in charge of, dealing with the user object, finding it, maybe creating one, if you had a database. The basic idea is just separation of concerns. By the way, if you're familiar with Passport already, you might be familiar with the verify callback, which you can check in the docs if you'd like. But this is basically equivalent to that. This validate that we're having here in the strategy is effectively mapping to verify callback, right? So kind of like in this documentation here, it says when Passport authenticates a request, it parses the credentials contained in that request and then invokes verify callback with those credentials as arguments. In this case, username and password. Same thing we're doing here, right? It's ultimately going to invoke validate automatically as it goes through the authentication flow, and it's going to provide the credentials in here, at least for this very specific example. If you were using a different strategy, which you'll see another one in a little bit in this video, you'll probably have different arguments in this method. And then you'll also see in the docs where it kind of does this, done user. That's the same thing as what we're doing here, except that instead of using a done method, we're just returning the user directly, and Nest kind of maps that correctly on behind the scenes for Passport. You'll notice that in Passport, they have this first argument reserved for potential errors, right? So if you pass an error into done, that's how it kind of tells, hey, Passport, something went wrong. But in our case, we're kind of just utilizing Nest's, its own exception handling. So if there's an error, you just throw the correct exception. All right, with this strategy in place, what we need to do is to go back into our auth module, and we need to add a couple of things in here. First of all, you need to add the Passport module in here. It's one of the things we installed earlier. And then now that we created that, remember that our strategy over here is a provider. It's an injectable. That means that we also need to register that here as local strategy. All right, now that we have all of that plumbing in place, what's really left is we need to be able to provide something to this login route here, a way for it to say, hey, log the user in. Basically, we want to invoke Passport in some way. And the way we're going to be doing this is by utilizing guards in NestJS. If you haven't heard of guards before, it might be worth doing a little bit of reading on the documentation. But the point of it is effectively a guard, as the name implies, is it kind of protects a route. It adds logic between the request and the route handler, and it has the responsibility of checking things like authentication, authorization. Is a user authenticated or authorized to continue? If so, keep going. If not, run some other logic or throw an error. In our case, we need to have a guard that says if the user is not logged in, trigger this entire authentication flow. So the way we're going to achieve that is in our auth folder, we're going to add another file, and we're going to call this local-auth.guard.ts. And similarly, this is just going to be a class which extends AuthGuard from Passport, NestJS Passport. And this is where you actually provide the name of your strategy. So in our case, this is local. And similarly to the strategy class, this also needs to be a provider, right? For now, we don't really need to add much more to this. We can go ahead and just add it. So in our login right here, we're gonna add UseGuards, and we're gonna import our local auth guard. Now, real quick about Passport before we continue. Again, ideally you know Passport already to really utilize this information well. So I recommend you look into it a little bit. But just to give you some things to understand, you'll notice that in Passport, right, you have the different strategies, and the way you tell Passport which strategy you're using is by providing those strings, right? Like, so for example, if there was a Twitter strategy, you do .authenticate Twitter or Facebook. That's what we're doing here in the guard. With the guard, this string right here is us telling Passport that we're going to be using the local strategy that we registered. And the way that gets registered is effectively when we use it as a provider in our module, it kind of automatically registers it as an existing strategy from Passport's perspective. The guard just allows us to tell Passport, yeah, we're going to use that strategy. So the important thing to understand here is you can implement multiple strategies at the same time if you'd like. So that's why you need to have these strings to kind of specify which of the strategies are you using. Now for Passport local specifically, you'll notice that in the documentation it tells you that you have to do Passport local, Passport authenticate local. That's how we know what string we need to provide to our guard here. And if you check the documentation of other strategies, usually they will tell you which one you need to use. So as an example, if we took a look at this Twitter one, for example, there should be some documentation in here which shows what string you need to use. Just look for passport.authenticate, and in this case you would be providing Twitter, right? So just to summarize, if you were using the Twitter strategy, you would make your own Twitter guard, and you're going to add the string Twitter here using the AuthGuard from Passport. All right, hopefully that's not confusing. Let me know in the comments if it is. The other thing to add with how Passport works is once the user kind of logs in and everything's valid, within this verify callback or validate method, the user that you return actually ends up in the request object. So if we were to add request here and make sure to import that from NestJS common, Passport will actually save that object and request that user. And this is how you can kind of utilize, all right, once the user is logged in, how can I get the details of that logged in user throughout the request lifecycle, right? So what I kind of expect here is when I call login, and assuming that it's successful, it's going to return to me the details of that person that logged in. So let's go ahead and test this real quick. Remember that I have these mock users, so I should be able to log in with my name and this password. So I'm going to open Insomnia here. You can also use Postman if you prefer that. So I'm just going to create a new login request here, and this needs to be a post. I'm going to do create, and I should probably run the application. Let's not forget to do that. So we're going to do npm run start dev, and this will run in localhost 3000. All right, no compilation errors. Let's go ahead and go back to Insomnia. So in my request, I should be able to go to http localhost 3000, and we're gonna do, if I were to just call post on login here and send, you'll see that it fails immediately because I didn't pass in the username and password. So let's do that in the body. We're gonna add JSON username, my name, and password. Right, and when we send, we get back the object. So let me try to summarize what happened so far. We sent a post request with a username and a password, right? So that goes into our app controller. It lands here, and then before it even gets down here, right? Like we don't yet have a request.user. It's gonna go through the guards to do that authentication, which it's gonna go through the logic of, hey, Passport use Passport local, which this is effectively going to trigger our local strategy, right? So it's gonna run into this behind the scenes. Eventually it's gonna call validate with the username and password that we passed into the body, right? And it's gonna use that username and password to validate the user, and eventually go into UsersService to find the user, make sure it exists, and then goes back into the AuthService to validate, make sure the password matches. At the end of that, you get back a user, assuming it exists and the password is correct, and then that user is returned. And when the user is returned from here, Passport will save that user in request.user, and then finally we actually get down to our handler, and by the time it gets down to our handler, request.user is already filled in with that logged in user. So that's how we're able to get that response back. All right, now we need to switch gears and talk about how are we gonna go about protecting this route, right? So we got the logged in user, but this route is not protected yet. If I were to go into Insomnia and create a new request, I'm just going to call this protected, and it has HTTP GET. If I were to make a call to /protected and hit send, I'm able to get my hello world response here, right? So it's not at all protected yet. We still need to do that. Also, another thing to point out, if I were to try and return, let's just say that we wanted to access who the logged in user is down here as well, right? So let's just do the same thing of return request.user here. Let's take a look at what happens. So even if after I logged in and go to protected and hit send here again, it comes back with an empty request.user because it effectively lost that login. So how do we deal with that? So at this point of the video, this is where it kind of forks into two different ways that you can accomplish this protection that we need to talk about. So one way that we're going to do first is you can introduce sessions so that when the user logs in, we're going to save this request.user in the session so that any subsequent requests after logging in, we just grab the user's details from the session and we should be able to access it easily like this. And then we can set up that session to expire, so that you don't have a user that is always logged in. So that's your option number one, is to utilize sessions. Now, the problem with sessions is obviously it introduces state, and you need to think about where exactly you're going to store that session, right? So for example, maybe you store it in Redis or something similar, some kind of data store. But let's say that maybe that doesn't fit your requirements. You don't really want to introduce another session store or any store, and perhaps you want to keep your API completely stateless, right? So the typical solution for that is introducing JWTs, which we're going to cover in more towards the second or later half of the video. And I'll add some timestamps to the description of the video if you need to jump around between the two strategies. But I think it's important to understand the difference between the two and what's the pros and cons. I don't think I can really discuss in full detail what the pros and cons are. So I would suggest that you do your own research, right? See what fits your requirements. So for example, just some quick notes that I can provide is with sessions, you kind of keep a lot of the information to yourself. You're kind of protecting the information of that user from going beyond the server, right? The server side, the backend. So it's a little bit more secure in a sense, but then you have sessions to manage, right? Now, when you go to the JWT side, you don't have sessions to manage. It's more stateless. However, you also need to watch out for the fact that, what if someone created a fake JWT, right? So you need to kind of check, is the JWT valid? So there's an extra validation step. So different kind of approaches depending on what you're trying to do. That's the basics of it. I highly recommend doing a little bit more research to really decide which way to go. And obviously there's other ways to do authentication, right? But I'm just showing you the two typical cases that I've personally seen. All right, so let's get started. We're gonna first start with the session strategy. The first thing we're gonna do is we're actually gonna create a new guard, which allows us to do that check of, hey, is there a session for this request, for this user that's making this request? So I'm going to create a new guard here, and I'm just going to call it authenticated .guard. Can't really think of a better name there. And this is just going to be export class authenticated guard. And you didn't know, if you're making custom guards, you got to do implements can activate, and similarly to what we've been doing to other things, make this injectable, and we're going to define a can activate method. And it's okay if you don't completely understand what's going on here. I'm going to try and type some stuff out and I'll explain it. All right, so here's our basic guard. What this is just doing is remember that guards are kind of just in between the request and the actual handling of that request. So it's able to kind of intercept what's happening with that request and kind of do some initial logic before it goes to the handler. In this case, we're just grabbing that request from the context, and then we're checking if it's authenticated. And this is actually something that comes from Passport automatically, which is what it's going to do is, assuming you did set up sessions, it's going to try and look for that session and say, does a session exist for this user? If so, keep going. So if there is an existing session for the user, this is going to return true, and it's going to allow the request to keep going down to the handler. So to kind of see this in action, we're going to add that here similarly using UseGuards. So I'm back in app controller. I'm going to add the new authenticated guard in here. So what I kind of expect to happen here is, obviously we didn't set up sessions yet, so I expect it to always fail at this point. So if I go into my Insomnia again and make my protected call, you'll notice that it's going to come back with a 403 forbidden resource because the user is not logged in. Now there's a missing piece, right? Ideally, when I do a login here and then go back to my protected, it's going to notice that, hey, this user is logged in, but right now it's not doing that. So that's where sessions come in, so that when we log in, we're going to save the user in that session, and we're going to be able to access our protected route. So first things first, back in the terminal, I'm going to do an npm install express session. Nice thing with Express is, because at least by default it's kind of just a layer that's working on top of Express, that means that you have a lot of reusable things in the Express ecosystem, including things like Express Session. So again, if you're coming from the Express land, a lot of this stuff probably is familiar to you. So in here, I'm just going to add some imports from Express Session and Passport. And by the way, I'm in main.ts, sort of the root of our application. And within here, this is where we're going to configure our session. So for example, here is some basic configuration that I copied from the Express Session documentation. Make sure you look into the documentation, by the way. Something that I think people make the mistake of is they don't really read into the best practices. So for example, this session secret, you should probably put that in an environment variable or something like that. Don't put that in the code. Also, by default, Express Session uses an in-memory session store. That does not work well in production. In fact, it's going to have memory leaks if you use it in production. So make sure that in a real environment, you utilize something like Redis or a database, wherever you want to save your sessions. Make sure to not use the in-memory one. It is not meant to be used for production, and that's covered in the documentation of Express Session, so make sure to look into it. Now, if you didn't know, the way Express Session works is when a new session is created for a user, it kind of comes back in the form of a cookie, but all that cookie has is effectively a key to the store. So imagine, as an example, let's say we have a Redis store for our session. When the user logs in, they get back a cookie which represents their key to that store. So the cookie itself does not have the user information. It just represents a key to the record that we have in the store itself. So one benefit there is we're never really exposing the user information directly with the client. We're just exposing a very basic cookie as a key to the store. And that cookie, you can add some configuration to it. Make sure to check the docs. One that's really important, I think, is adding a max age. This is, I believe, an hour in milliseconds. I could be wrong. But basically, you don't want a cookie that is never expiring. You want to make sure that it expires at some point. All right, next thing we're going to add here is we're just going to add passport initialize and passport session. These are sort of just the things that you need to make sure to have if you're going to use sessions with Passport. This is also covered in the Passport documentation if you'd like to learn more. And then finally, we need to create a new file here to do our serializers. So I'm going to create a new file called session.serializer.ts. And let me just type out some code real quick and I'll explain what we have. All right, so we've got a session serializer here. Notice that it's extending passport serializer. The idea here is before it goes into our session, we need to serialize the user object, and as it comes out of the session, we need to deserialize it. So it's up to you how you do that logic. So for example, in this very specific example, the user that we return from validate in our local strategy, so this user, basically the user with just the ID and the name, that's what ends up being passed into the serialized user. So as it's trying to save that object into the session, it goes into this method, and then it's up to us what we specifically actually save in the session store. So right now we're simply just saying we're just going to save that whole object, which is just the ID and the name. You absolutely can set this up to just be like the ID if you want, like that. You know, if you're maybe trying to keep the session record small, or you're trying to not expose too much information there, you can do that. And then within this deserialized user, right, you can also inject UsersService in here via constructor, and you can do something like, you know, constant this dot, you know, user equals this dot, you know, UsersService, you know, dot find by ID or whatever. Pass in your payload.id, right? And then you can take whatever you get back and return it like that. So that's a scenario where perhaps you want to only save the ID into the session, but on deserialize, maybe you want to get the full information from the database or another API call. It's up to you. But for this tutorial, I'm going to go back to what I had before. We're just going to have just straight up serialize the user object that we have, which is already pretty simple anyways, and just deserialize that and get it back. All right, so what we save is what we get back. Pretty simple. All right, one last step that we need to make sure to do is back in the auth module, we need to register that serializer. So we're going to add session serializer here in our auth module providers. And then for the passport module, we need to add register session true. Actually, to be honest, from my testing, I'm not sure that this is strictly necessary, but I assume that that register method is there for a reason, so you might as well set the session through there. So basically, you should understand that session is false by default unless you set it up that way. Actually, I was wrong. There is one more thing that we need to change within our local AuthGuard. The missing piece here is we still need to tell this to trigger an actual login via creating a session. And the way to do that is, let me add some code here. So I added a custom can activate here, which similarly just gets back the request. And in this case, we're just going to trigger this login, which we pass the request in. All right, so this is kind of just one gotcha that you need to remember is if you're going to trigger, if you want sessions, you got to remember to trigger this super login. This is the step that I always just keep forgetting. So with that out of the way, so back in our app controller, I'm just going to update this login to respond with something different, maybe just a message, right? Because I actually want to return. I want to show that we're able to get the request user that's in the session down here in the protected request, right? So back in Insomnia, in our /login post route, I've got my username and password. I'm going to hit send, and it'll tell me you got logged in. But there's something new here. You'll notice that the cookie now has this thing, right? Remember we talked about how with Express Session, it creates a cookie, but that cookie just represents the key to the session store. It doesn't have much more information beyond that. So this cookie, effectively, if you were doing this on a client, the cookie gets saved in the browser, and the rest of the requests going forward is going to utilize that cookie to kind of simulate that this user is still logged in. And remember that you can have those cookies expire at a certain time interval that you set. So you'll notice in Insomnia, there's a cookie section here, which is going to have this cookie that I got back from here, right? And it's going to automatically attach that to the rest of the requests. And it should work similarly in a browser environment. It'll just kind of automatically provide it in subsequent requests. So when I make a call to my protected route here, when I hit send, we get back the user object. So let's break down again kind of what happened is back in the code, we went into login, and then as it logs in, it goes through that passport loop of what I talked about earlier. But the step we added is after it goes into this local strategy and returns a user, this user is saved into our session store. It's serialized. And then what happens is we, along with this login, we return back a cookie, which the client can now utilize for subsequent requests. And when it goes into another request that requires a user session, in our case, we added an authenticated guard. So what will effectively happen here is this guard will check if the user is authenticated by first looking to see, all right, do you have that cookie with the session ID? It's then going to use that session ID to see, is there an existing record in our session store with that same key? And it's also going to check things like, is that session expired or maybe already got deleted and garbage collected? But basically, if it doesn't find the session record in the store, it's going to assume you're not authenticated. But if it does find it, then it's going to assume you are authenticated, and then it lets you pass through. So after it returns through here, it eventually gets to our get hello handler here and actually accesses that session state that we had, which is just the user object. So that kind of just completes the flow of now we're able to log a user in, and we're able to utilize sessions to keep a user logged in. And again, remember in main.ts, we added session config here, which you should customize for your needs. Again, move the secret to somewhere secure, like from the environment variables. Make sure to set a max age on your cookie so that it's able to kind of expire itself and kind of ask the user to trigger a new login because, hey, your session expired. And there are, if you check the documentation, there's a bunch of other things you can configure for cookies regarding security that you absolutely should look into, right? So I'm showing you the fundamentals here. You need to take initiative in understanding the rest in terms of security. All right, so that wraps up our first path that I mentioned earlier of taking the session-based approach. Now, our second path again is going the JWT route of not having sessions. We're just going to have this access token that we kind of pass around, and that's effectively where the state is going to live. So before we get to that part, I'm going to do some cleanup to basically get our code back to what it was before we added sessions. So I'm going to remove this UseGuards, which is doing logic to check if a user has a session. In the main.ts, I'm going to remove the session configuration, and I'm going to remove this passport initialize session stuff. You don't actually need that anymore. And then in the auth module, I'm going to remove this register with the session true from the passport config, and I'm going to remove the session serializer. One more thing to clean up is in our local AuthGuard. Remember that we added this can activate, which again, this super.login is effectively triggering passport to use sessions. We don't actually want that with JWTs because it's sessionless, it's stateless. So we're just going to delete that, and we're just going to keep this as a simple class like so. All right, so from here, we're back to sort of where we started, where we still have that login, but now here we need to kind of switch this up to do on login return a JWT access token, right? And then over here, we need to do something where we need to do, basically we need to require this to have an access token. And then we also need to make sure that that token is valid. Okay, so that's where we're gonna start, and we're gonna do the JWT stuff. All right, the first thing we need to do is back in the terminal, we're gonna install a couple of things here. First of all, we're gonna install NestJS/JWT and Passport JWT. So NestJS JWT is kind of just a companion library that the Nest guys made, which helps with things like creating JWTs and stuff like that. And then Passport JWT is a specific passport strategy specifically for JWT. So what it does is effectively it looks for a JWT in a request, and then it does things like verifying to make sure that, oh, this token is valid. So we'll go and discuss that a little bit more, but first let's get some things installed and hooked up. So make sure to install both of those. And again, you probably need to install the types. Now I should mention that this video is not really the best video for understanding what JWTs are or when they are best to be used over sessions. I mean, I gave some basic thoughts earlier, but I think if you don't already know what JWTs are, I would recommend you spend a little bit of time reading about it, maybe before continuing this video. I kind of just assumed that you have some basic knowledge of what it is. I'm just showing you specifically the how to do it with Nest and Passport. All right, so how we're going to get started in here is within the AuthService, we are going to import a JWT service from that dependency that we just installed. Now this service is something that we can inject into this AuthService via constructor, just like any other service. All right, so what we'll do in this AuthService is we're going to create a new login method, which takes in a user. And effectively what we're going to try to do here is create a new JWT. And to do that, first we need to create some kind of payload that has the information that we want to save in our JWT. In our case, we're just going to save the name of the user. And then typically with JWTs, I believe it's sort of common practice to have this sub property to be the ID. And what we're going to do is we're just going to return an object which has an access token, and to create that actual JWT access token, we're going to use the JWT service, and we're just going to use that to sign our payload. All right, now that we have that in place, what we actually need to do back in the auth module is to register the JWT module, again coming from NestJS JWT, and we're going to register something here. We need to provide a secret, which I'm just going to create a very basic string. We'll add some basic options here, like we can set up our JWTs to expire in 60 seconds. Now, real quick note about this. Again, just like how our session secret, I mentioned that ideally you are not storing that in plain strings like this. Put this in your environment variables. Right, this is extremely important. This needs to be something that is not exposed to anybody. This should be, and I'm going to explain in a little bit why this is important, but for now, know that that is an important string which allows us to validate our JWTs, and we'll discuss that a little bit more. And since we added a new login method to our auth service, we're actually going to be utilizing that login method in the app controller that we have. So that means that we need to make sure that our auth service is in the exports here so that we can import the auth service in the app controller. So we're going to add auth service in exports. Now back in app controller, now that auth service is in the exports, I can actually import it in here. I'll just replace this app service that we're not really using. I'll do auth service, right? Now we added a to-do here that we need to return the created JWT access token. So what we're going to do is we're going to return this .authService.login, and remember that login method requires that we pass a user into that. And how do we get that user? Via request.user. right? So this should take care of our to-do. Now let's just go back in Insomnia and kind of see if this is working. So back in my, let me clear this history. Back in my login route, I'm gonna hit send. And now the response that we get back is an access token. Now, what is this, right? If hopefully, again, you know a little bit about JWTs, but if we were to copy that and put it into something like JWT.io, I can paste my JWT in here, and you can see that to some degree we're able to decode it, and we can see that it has that name and the sub ID, which is the user ID, and it also expires at a certain time period. But notice that it's saying it's invalid signature because it's not able to completely kind of decode it, because there's a missing piece in our signature, which is the secret, right? So if I typed in our super secure secret here, notice that now the signature is verified, and that's how we're going to be doing JWT verification. Is we're going to be utilizing that secret to do the verification. That's why you need to make sure you keep that string secure. You don't want to pass that around, because when you pass that around, then people can just kind of make fake JWTs for your application if it were somehow, you know, stolen from you. All right, so we've got that working. We're able to make a JWT. What's the missing piece? The missing piece is protecting this route with that access token. So how do we do that? So remember that we installed a JWT strategy for Passport. So in our auth directory, we are going to create a new strategy file in here called jwt.strategy.ts. And similar to our local strategy, this is going to be a class. I'm going to call it JWT strategy, which extends passport strategy. And again, you need to provide the actual strategy that we're using here. In our case, we're trying to use the JWT strategy, the passport JWT strategy, right? Notice that they all kind of export a strategy object like this that we pass in here, and then make this injectable because it's a provider. And remember, I said earlier that to configure your strategy, you do that in the constructor via the super, right? So within here is where we provide configuration for the JWT, the passport JWT strategy. You know, if you look in the documentation of this passport JWT, you'll notice that, you know, it takes in an options object. So for example, it allows you to pass in a secret or key, right? And that's going to be our super secret string. Again, I need to keep calling this out. You got to protect the string, pull it from environment variables or wherever else you want, where it's not completely exposed or hard coded in any way in your code, right? Obviously, this is a tutorial, so I'm trying to make it simple for you to follow. So we're just using the, you know, this string like that. You know, you can add other things in here like ignore expiration, which we're gonna say is false, right? Because this is part of the security, where if you set up your JWTs to expire for, in our case, I think we said 60 seconds here, but let's say in your case you do an hour or 1 day, you know, you don't want a token that forever has access. You want it to sort of expire, or at least be invalid at some point in time. We also need to tell this exactly how to get that access token, and you do that via this JWT from request and this extract the JWT from auth header as bearer token, right? So it's gonna look in the headers of the request, and it's gonna expect that there's a bearer token in there, and that's gonna be our JWT. And it's probably important to discuss why again are we using the same secret here. Well, remember that if we go into the JWT.io, the only way it's able to verify that our JWT is valid is by decoding it and making sure that it has the correct signature by, you know, checking what algorithm it's using and what secret it's using. It kind of makes a combination of that to determine, is this a valid JWT, which is why you need to protect this value, because it's what's going to determine if the passing JWT is something that you created, your server created, not some other, fake server, right? So part of this, as it goes through this constructor, it's going to extract the JWT from the headers, and then it's going to do its validation. And then once it's done validating, it goes into this validate method, and it just passes in the payload. The payload in this case is the decoded JWT. So going back into this JWT IO, notice that it's encoded, right? The decoded value, which is just the JSON payload, is what ends up being passed down to this validate. So that's what this payload is going to be. So if we go back to our AuthService and put that side by side here, remember that it's effectively equivalent to this same payload here. So we should expect a name and a sub property, and we're basically just going to translate that to be, what do we want our user object to look like? Well, we're just going to translate it to ID is the payload.sub, and the name is just the payload.name. And again, the way Passport works is whatever you return in this validate method is what's going to be saved in request.user. So we'll see an example of that in just a little bit here. But real quick, what might be confusing here is it says validate, but we're not really validating anymore. It's just returning the value. Well, that's because the actual validation already happened up here as it goes through the strategy. It extracts the JWT from the request, it verifies it, it validates it, and once, assuming that all goes correctly, it's gonna decode the payload and pass it down here. So there's really not much more we can do in the validate here other than just return the object. Now, one thing that you can do is maybe you have more information about the user in the database, right? So for example, maybe we just save the ID and the JWT and nothing else, because you don't want to expose that to the external world. So maybe here you do something like, maybe you import the UsersService in here and you get by ID of something, right? And then you can return that user, right? But we don't have that. We're not going to do that. So we'll just keep it simple. But this is where you can add logic like that, where once you validate that this is a correct JWT and you've got enough information to find your user object, whatever that is, maybe it's in your database, you can make a call to get that, and then you can return that. And then again, whatever you return here becomes available in request.user. So the missing piece that we have here is we need a way to kind of trigger the strategy when we call this protected route. We need to trigger doing that, extracting the JWT from the request and validating it. So similarly to what we done before, we're going to create another file here. Remember that you have to create guards, which effectively represent your strategies, your passport strategies. So we're going to create a JWT-AuthGuard.ts, and let me add some code in here, save you some time. But you've seen this before, right? So we're creating an AuthGuard from Passport, and again, we're providing that string to kind of signal Passport which strategy are we using, and in this case we're using the JWT strategy, and we do have to register this strategy in the auth module before I forget. So we're going to add that in our providers here. So we're going to add JWT strategy, right? So this kind of registers it, and then the guard allows us to utilize it. So now the only missing piece is to use that guard on our protected route. So we're going to do use guards, and we just made a new JWT auth guard. Make sure that's imported. All right, now let's go see if this works. All right, so I have a fresh slate here in Insomnia. If I try to access that protected route right now, it should tell me 401 unauthorized because we don't have the JWT access token. If I go into my login with username and password and I hit send, it's going to generate me a new access token. Remember, we set this up to expire in 60 seconds. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back to my protected route. I'm going to add that as a bearer token. Paste that there, hit send, and now we're back to getting our user object. So just like before, let me try to break this down step by step to explain what's happening. So what we did in Insomnia was we called the protected route without the JWT. So it goes into this guard and it kind of triggers this JWT strategy, and this is going to try and extract a bearer token out of the request, but it didn't have, originally we didn't provide a token. So it's just going to straight up fail, and it just goes back with the 401. Now we eventually did call the login route again. And again, this goes back into how the Passport Local works to log us in. But the thing we added this time around is this new AuthService.login, which just takes that user that we got back from logging in with Passport Local, and then we just turned that into a payload, which we signed and turned into a JWT, and then eventually we return that JWT to the response, to the client, and then the client can then take that JWT access token and provide it as a bearer token in the authorization header, so that the second time that we called protected, in that case it did have a JWT. So again, it goes into this strategy. It extracts the token from the request. It makes sure that it's not expired. And then finally it checks, again, this is where the secret comes into play. It checks that the JWT that we have was something that we made, our server made, right? Because in our auth module, we provided a secret here, and that secret is utilized in our signing in the JWT service.sign in the auth service. So the secret over here just verifies that it came from us and not somewhere else. So this is very important. And then eventually it says that, yep, you got a valid token. It's going to take that token and it's going to decode it into a payload, a JSON payload, and we're simply just getting what we need out of that payload, which eventually gets saved into, as we return it here, it gets saved into request.user. Eventually, we make it down to the actual handling of the request, which simply just accesses that request.user. So then we return our user object back, right? So I hope all of that made sense. It might be worth it for me to kind of show you what happens if, let's say there was another, malicious server that tries to create a fake JWT, but they didn't have our secret, right? This was hidden somewhere. So perhaps they used a different secret string here. So if we were to generate a new access token, right? So imagine this is now a hacker trying to make their own access token, but they don't have our secret. If we were to take that access token and try to use it in our protected route, let's see how this behaves. We hit send, and it's going to say 401 unauthorized. So it's very important that the secret that you use to sign your JWT is the same exact secret that you use to verify the JWT. So again, make sure you put that in a common environment variable or something so that both of these places can utilize the same exact value, right? So in the auth module and in the strategy configuration. All right, folks, that's really it. That's the fundamentals of doing, typical authentication. There could be, depending on the strategy that you're using, it could look a little bit different in your case. You might be utilizing a different session store, or maybe you're using a different identity provider, right? Instead of doing username and password and maintaining that in your own database, maybe you're using, Azure or Google or Facebook, any of those typical OIDC or OAuth patterns, you should be able to use that in Nest as well. But if you have the fundamentals of how do you utilize an existing passport strategy, how do you create sessions if you need it, and how do you do things like JWT, signing, and verification, that's really most of what I think a huge majority of people would need. Anyways, guys, this was a super long video. I hope that this was useful. Definitely make sure to like, subscribe, if anything, if you find it useful, make sure to hit like and maybe add a comment or two or whatever, just for it lets me know if the work that I'm putting out provides value to people. And also when you do that stuff, it helps YouTube promote my content to other people so that other people are getting that same value out of my content as you are. Anyways, if you want to see more stuff like this, I'm definitely going to be making more Node.js and front-end content, so make sure to subscribe. With that said, I will catch you in the next one. Thanks.